1,495 square miles. That is the net total of Ukrainian territory the Russian military managed to seize over the last 12 months. It represents roughly 0.6% of Ukraine, an area matching the physical footprint of Rhode Island. To acquire this single sliver of land, the Kremlin spent up to 1.1 million Russian soldiers killed or severely wounded. The death toll alone stands at 350,000 men. This is the raw exchange rate of the war. An entire generation fed into a concrete grinder for a patch of regional farmland. A conventional state looks at this ratio and flinches. A conventional state possesses a feedback loop where regional governors, draft boards, and mourning families exert a visible political cost. The Russian system operates on a different mathematical logic because it severed that loop on purpose. For 4 decades, analyst David Satter repeated a single sentence that Washington dismissed as an eccentric exaggeration. He argued that the Kremlin is not a government in the conventional sense, but an organized criminal syndicate sitting on top of the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth. Today, that sentence reads like an economic forecast. The people at the apex of this structure do not experience human casualties as a loss. They experience them as an input. When a system treats its own population as raw material rather than citizens, the math that would paralyze a functioning democracy ceases to register. The continuation of the war is not a failure of military strategy. It is a structural prerequisite for domestic survival. Somewhere during the glacial advance across the Donbas, the campaign stopped being about Ukraine. It transformed into the largest internal transfer of wealth and power inside Russia since the Soviet Union collapsed. When Western corporations fled and sanctions isolated the old oligarchs from their European assets, billions of dollars in domestic property remained on the ground. The Kremlin did not let these assets evaporate, it redistributed them. Since early 2025, Moscow accelerated the violent seizure of strategic assets, recovering an estimated $30 billion. The mechanism of this transfer reveals the true nature of the state architecture. There is no central register of these nationalized holdings. The state moves massive corporate empires from one set of hands to another, while ensuring no auditor, journalist, or citizen can total the ledger. This is the bookkeeping of a syndicate that knows never to leave a paper trail lying around. The targets of these seizures are no longer just the remnants of foreign firms. They are homegrown industrial empires once considered untouchable. Consider Konstantin Strukov, a billionaire gold producer who maintained absolute public loyalty to the regime. Prosecutors stripped his control of Russia's third-largest gold enterprise, hit him with corruption charges, and invalidated his passport while he attempted to board a flight to Turkey. His compliance did not protect him. In the current phase, passive support is no longer sufficient. Private property must directly align with Kremlin strategy or face immediate liquidation. This selective destruction serves a precise structural purpose. Putin is engineering an entirely new class of proprietors. By doling out seized corporate assets for free or at artificially low prices, the regime creates a network of owners who owe their massive fortunes exclusively to the survival of one man. If the current authority collapses, their titles vanish instantly. The external war creates the precise domestic disorder required to justify these forced expropriations. Ending the conflict would freeze the music in a dangerous game of asset reallocation, forcing the elite to ask who truly owns Russia and at whose expense. This is why public peace gestures invariably dissolve under inspection. Every apparent concession from the Kremlin contains fine print designed to guarantee a Ukrainian rejection. This internal wealth machine requires massive liquidity to function. Until mid-2024, the state treasury possessed enough slack to achieve 3 goals simultaneously: fully fund the military, maintain social stability, and distribute lucrative rents to the loyal elite. By late autumn, that financial cushion disappeared. The official budget, spanning 2025 through 2027, dictates that civilian development must contract to guarantee the survival of the defense industry. The system has reached the absolute limits of its financial elasticity. The strain is breaking the recruitment mechanism. The federal government currently spends over 2 billion rubles a day on one-time enlistment bonuses, while individual regional payouts surge to a record median of 1.55 million rubles. actual volunteer recruitment fell by 20% in the first quarter of 2026. The state now pays double the capital to secure 800 men a day instead of the 1,200 it gathered a year ago. The market has processed the reality that an enlistment contract is a one-way ticket. This deficit creates a critical systemic contradiction. The regional budgets forced to write these multi-million ruble checks have buckled into a collective deficit of 1.5 trillion rubles. The current recruitment rate of 30,000 men a month is barely sufficient to replace the dead and wounded. The machine is running flat out just to stand still on a battlefield that yields a Rhode Island per year. When financial incentives dry up and walking away threatens the elite structure, a criminal architecture has only one remaining move. It must transition from purchase to extraction. The Ministry of Education recently ordered university rectors to recruit a flat 2% of their total student body into contract military service. This is the turn inward. A regime that cannot win abroad and cannot afford peace at home must sustain itself by tightening the vice on its own population. The pressure exported to the front lines is refracting back into Russian society. The mechanism of voluntary compliance has fractured, and the system is about to find out what happens when it begins to burn its own foundation for fuel. The paralysis of a complex system begins at its physical junctions, where technical decay converts a single friction point into a structural fracture. The Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian refining capacity did not merely destroy corporate infrastructure. They triggered an immediate domestic energy emergency. By April 2026, the Kremlin enacted a total embargo on gasoline and diesel exports to stabilize internal retail prices. This emergency measure stripped the state of its primary source of non-oil foreign currency, while simultaneously starving the agricultural provinces of essential fuel during the peak spring sowing cycle. In the agrarian hubs of Krasnodar and Rostov, 1/3 of the commercial tractor fleet stood idle for lack of fuel allocation, directly compromising the upcoming harvest and triggering a domestic food supply bottleneck. This regional energy deficit intersected with a broader mechanical failure across the state logistics network. The Russian railway system relies entirely on heavy freight locomotives that require foreign-manufactured high-precision ball bearings and computerized engine components. Sanctions evasion networks failed to fulfill the sheer volume of replacements required for 24-hour military transport schedules. By mid-May 2026, the state railway enterprise sidelined 740 locomotives simultaneously due to mechanical exhaustion. A classified internal directive ordered the absolute prioritization of military hardware echelons over civilian freight, stranding millions of tons of industrial metals, coal, and fertilizer in remote Siberian transit yards. Non-military cargo movement collapsed by 18% within a single quarter, severing the supply lines between raw material producers and manufacturing centers. Simultaneously, the domestic civil aviation sector reached a point of absolute technical obsolescence. The state-mandated cannibalization of commercial aircraft for spare parts reached its logical conclusion when the domestic fleet shrank by 45% due to uncertified maintenance failures. Major domestic carriers cancelled 2/3 of regional flights connecting Moscow to the Far Eastern administrative centers. This physical isolation of the provinces shattered the internal market, preventing the movement of specialized technical personnel required to maintain regional industrial operations. The geographical vastness of the state, once protected by a heavily subsidized transport network, transformed into an unmanageable logistics barrier to arrest the resulting depreciation of the ruble and suppress runaway consumer inflation. The central bank executed a desperate monetary intervention, raising the benchmark interest rate to an unprecedented 23%. This decision induced an immediate liquidity freeze across the domestic corporate landscape. Defense enterprises operating under rigid, multi-year state contracts could no longer secure commercial loans to purchase raw inputs, because their fixed profit margins remained locked below 8% while borrowing costs tripled. To prevent a total stoppage of missile and armored vehicle production lines, the Ministry of Finance bypassed the banking system entirely, initiating massive unbacked credit emissions. The state began printing fiat currency to sustain industrial output, guaranteed only by weapons that vanish on the battlefield within hours of arrival. This flood of printed currency entered an economic space completely depleted of human labor. The subtraction of over 1 million men via battlefield casualties, paired with the concentration of 3.5 million workers inside round-the-clock defense plants, generated an absolute deficit of 4.8 million specialized personnel across the civilian economy. By early 2026, machine building and chemical processing plants reported a chronic 35% vacancy rate. The state attempted to stabilize the factories by enacting emergency labor decrees that lowered the legal working age to 14 and permitted the deployment of forced prison labor directly into strategic manufacturing sectors. Human capital ceased to be a renewable resource. It became a rapidly diminishing asset managed through state coercion. The destruction of the civilian workforce accelerated the collapse of the non-defense tax base. In January 2026, the federal government implemented a radical progressive income tax scale alongside a flat increase in corporate tax rates to 25%, designed to extract capital from the population to fund the military deficit. The mechanism produced the exact opposite result. Within 90 days of implementation, 400,000 small and medium-sized enterprises formally filed for liquidation to avoid the punitive fiscal regime. The surviving private sector retreated into the shadow economy, using cash and barter systems to conceal transactions from the Federal Tax Service. The state succeeded in raising tax rates while simultaneously shrinking the total volume of taxable economic activity. This economic evasion triggered a fatal crisis in municipal infrastructure. The lack of localized tax revenues halted the maintenance of municipal heating grids and water treatment facilities across 40 regional capitals. During the transition into the spring thaw, over 2,000 major infrastructure ruptures occurred, leaving millions of citizens without basic utility access. The federal center, entirely focused on financing the military apparatus, rejected regional appeals for emergency infrastructure funding. The daily survival of the population shifted from an economic challenge to a physical confrontation with a disintegrating built environment. This structural decay has now reached the domestic security apparatus that keeps the regime in power. The hyperinflationary wave generated by unbacked money printing rapidly eroded the purchasing power of municipal police forces and internal security units across the regions. Simultaneously, the federal center failed to transfer scheduled budgetary subsidies to 32 separate administrative components because the defense fund absorbed the remaining liquid reserves. For 3 decades, the central authority maintained provincial loyalty through predictable financial distribution. By late May 2026, regional governors began quietly defying federal mandates, retaining local corporate tax collections within their own borders to pay local security personnel and prevent municipal food riots. The financial feedback loops have broken completely. The defense sector consumes the raw materials, the logistics network cannot move the products, the civil aviation system isolates the managers, the central bank prints the currency to cover the insolvency, and the inflation destroys the local administrative budget. Every intervention designed to stabilize one sector inflicts immediate, fatal damage on an adjacent node. The Kremlin no longer manages a country. It manages a series of cascading systemic emergencies where each choice shortens the operational lifespan of the entire structure. The mechanical reserves are exhausted, the monetary illusions have dissolved, and the domestic enforcement architecture is shifting its focus from external conquest to immediate physical self-preservation. June 2026 finds the Russian state trapped within a financial vice of its own construction. In Western financial institutions, exactly $300 billion of Russian sovereign assets remain locked behind layers of international sanctions, while European authorities execute the first automated transfers of the windfall profits from these funds directly into long-term Ukrainian defense procurement. The Kremlin can neither access this capital nor arrest its execution. This external architecture presents a direct, fatal contrast to the immediate liquidity crisis within the Russian Federal Treasury. The Ministry of Finance has completely exhausted the liquid, currency-denominated portion of its national wealth fund, leaving less than $12 billion in accessible gold reserves, to support a highly volatile war economy that consumes over $300 million every 24 hours to balance the current 2026 federal budget and avoid an immediate halt to domestic administrative functions. The state requires global oil prices to maintain an absolute average of $115 per barrel. Today, international benchmarks position Urals crude in the mid-60s due to the combination of Western price caps and secondary sanctions on maritime shipping insurance. This $50 deficit per barrel translates directly into a $45 billion structural crater in the state's annual revenue. The decisions emerging from the Kremlin to plug this leak are both mathematically insufficient and violently disruptive. The introduction of an emergency progressive income tax up to 22% and a retroactive levy on corporate property will generate less than 6% of the missing capital. The state is printing unbacked rubles to mask an absolute deficit that guarantees systemic insolvency before the conclusion of the fiscal year. The true weight of this fiscal evasion falls directly upon the peripheral administrative regions and the underclass. The federal center has formally suspended all civilian infrastructure subsidies to 64 of Russia's 83 administrative components. Consequently, provincial healthcare systems have delayed essential medical procedures by an average of 9 months due to a 40% deficit in imported pharmaceutical components and diagnostic equipment. While the elite within the Moscow Ring Road navigate these shortages through sophisticated black market networks, the provincial population faces a 35% spike in basic consumer staples. The historical social contract that traded individual political passivity for basic material predictability has collapsed into an extractive regime where citizens yield their wealth and their lives without receiving basic municipal security in return. This economic degradation intersects with a profound social crisis returning directly from the front lines. Every month, approximately 25,000 permanently disabled or severely traumatized soldiers re a civilian economy completely devoid of the structural capacity required to absorb them. Regional budgets cannot fulfill statutory pension obligations or maintain specialized psychological rehabilitation centers. Violent crime rates involving weapons smuggled from the combat zone escalated by 48% across industrial provincial towns in early 2026. The state successfully militarized its population to sustain a stagnant front line. But it cannot demilitarize the survivors who return to broken towns with worthless currency and immediate access to black market hardware within the upper echelons of the regime. The rapid contraction of the available resource pool has transformed the elite architecture into a purely cannibalistic ecosystem. The new class of proprietors, who acquired seized foreign assets during the initial wave of nationalization, now faces aggressive asset extortion from the state security services, the Siloviki. These security agencies require fresh capital to maintain their own institutional loyalty and fund domestic surveillance networks. The state no longer targets external actors or explicit political dissidents. It is actively consuming its own loyalists. Weekly corruption indictments targeting senior defense officials and industrial directors serve a specific structural purpose. They provide the public with scapegoats for material shortages, while allowing competing Kremlin factions to seize the remaining liquid accounts of the accused. On the geopolitical stage, Russia's total isolation has stripped it of strategic leverage, converting its economic partnerships into relationships of absolute colonial dependency. Beijing has exploited the Kremlin's loss of European markets by demanding a permanent 45% discount on all remaining natural gas deliveries through the Power of Siberia pipeline. Simultaneously, Chinese state enterprises have acquired controlling equity stakes in Russia's largest mining, logging, and metal processing firms across Siberia for pennies on the dollar. The Kremlin did not achieve the multipolar alliance promised by its propaganda. It engineered the systemic transfer of its own sovereign resource base to a neighboring superpower that dictates economic terms without committing a single soldier to the field. The systemic collapse of the Russian architecture is not a hypothetical event waiting to occur. It is an active, irreversible structural process. The regime cannot implement a political off-ramp because the termination of the war would instantly expose the financial vacuum holding the entire economy together. The stolen assets would lose their legal camouflage, the regional deficits would trigger immediate administrative mutinies, and millions of families would demand a calculation for the dead. The war is no longer an instrument of territorial conquest. It has become